Well, there was another quote that caught our eye this week with the 49ers, and it came from tight end George Kittle. He was on Theo Vaughn, who is a comedian. He's actually pretty funny. I do enjoy his stuff. Was on his podcast talking about, kind of just like sort of the rigors of the NFL season. Kittle, who is very realistic and I think articulate, and he opens up a lot about his personal life. Obviously, he's very entertaining off the field, but he's also very open and honest, and I do appreciate that about him. Was talking about the stress that specifically social media can cause. I think he was talking about football players, but he meant athlete. He said athletes, and basically that, because people nitpick and grab videos and hone in on one player's worst moment, that it can sort of follow them either for a game, for a season, for a career. First place my mind went was JaVale McGee and Shaq Did a Fool. He became sort of associated with those low light clips, even though he ended up having a near 20-year career in the NBA, still is playing. But George Kittle with football was talking about how social media has allowed people to basically tear apart certain athletes when they want to. And I'll throw it to you first and ask your thoughts on this because I have some of my own, but I don't think he's necessarily that far off.
No, and I think it's fair. First of all, I think it's hard for us and 99% of our audience to fairly understand what George Kittle is talking about, because we don't live in the same public sphere that George Kittle does and that his teammates do. Um, we don't know what it's like to open up Twitter, try to take your mind off, a bad game or, issues at home or just a bad day in general. Try to distract yourself and you open up Twitter or Instagram or whatever. And the first thing you do is, first thing you see is, oh my gosh, how did George Kittle drop that touchdown? Like, it was right in his hands. There was no one near him. It's embarrassing. And it has 100,000 impressions and there's people talking about it all over the place. Like, it's impossible for you and me and our audience to understand what that feels like. So I think, first of all, I trust George Kittle in this instance because I have no personal experience at that level to be able to say, yeah, I know what you're feeling like. But I can kind of imagine. I mean, I use social media probably more than I should, but I like to use it as an escape, as a distraction. And if what I see was people maybe not attacking, but at least making fun of a mistake I made, that will be a little hard to swallow for me. So I can understand where George Kittle's coming from.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I think the introduction of publicly accessible tape, like all 22, for
Yeah.
example, allows you or I or a media member or the average fan who's willing to pay for it access to all of these plays, and they can literally hone in if they'd like on a single play on a single
Yeah.
player and follow them throughout a game. And in football, I do think it's different than basketball or even baseball because there's so many different moving parts at the same time. It doesn't often jump off your screen when a minor mistake is made. And I think this is what George Kittle is kind of talking about, is that those minor mistakes get highlighted by someone that is looking for it and that is looking to try and damage the image or the play of a particular NFL athlete. That I do understand. And I think that social media has maybe heightened that aspect of criticism when it comes to NFL players. Where I would push back is this. If we're being honest, Mark, this has happened since the introduction of sports. Like it hasn't, it has now evolved through social media, but what do they do on Sports Center? They show highlights. They have a Sports Center not top 10. They show lowlights. Before television, there was print, and athletes were heavily criticized by writers going back to the 1870s when baseball was introduced. Like, there was, and a lot of horror stories of the amount of, criticism that certain athletes in all sports would take, the amount of vitriol that they would receive from fans because of what was written about them and specific plays that were highlighted throughout these games. I mean, You could look at the great home run race of 1961 and read about how Roger Maris's hair was falling out because of the pressure and the people not wanting him to break this record, and Mickey Mantle being the guy that everyone wanted to do it. Doug Williams dealing with the criticism of being the first black quarterback to win a Super Bowl, and the fallout from that, and some of the things that were written about him and how fans treated him. And even nowadays, of course, with the amount of highlights we see posted on social media for NBA players and guys stumbling over themselves, or getting crossed over, getting dunked on, like, all of that has always been there. And while I do think that Kittle's point is valid about social media maybe evolving it or turning it up a certain notch, at the end of the day, I do kind of push back a little, because that's kind of always been the case.
It has been, but it's more easily accessible, and I think there's a much greater likelihood that if you were to make a mistake, and I think it's also important to know, especially in a sport like football, as you were saying, if you're searching, like you don't even have to just be watching a game normally. You say, "Hey, George Kittle dropped that pass. Like, I'm gonna go make fun of him on Twitter." You could have a predisposition to not like someone. Say you were a fan of the Nebraska Cornhuskers, so naturally you hate George Kittle because he's an Iowa Hawkeye. You're like, you know what? I'm going to have some fun at his expense on Twitter today. I'm going to go and watch the game film and look for something he did wrong. And football is such a sport with so many plays, with such intricate blocking schemes. You can find something that a player did wrong. At least one, probably more like a handful. No matter how good you are, no matter if you're a future Hall of Famer or not, you can find a mistake that any individual player made in any individual game. And it's just so much more accessible, to your point. So I think that you're right. This sort of thing has happened. It's just the nature of humanity, but it's way more accessible now. I mean, when you first brought this up, the first thing I thought of, and this isn't necessarily, down the, I don't know, the vitriol road. It hasn't been a terrible situation. But the first thing I thought of was Mark Sanchez and the butt fumble. When I say Mark Sanchez, it's the first thing you think of, right? And that
Dan
was like
Orlovsky.
Dan Orlovsky running out of the back of the end zone, 100%. I mean, the butt fumble was what, like 08? Like something like that. It was around the beginning of Twitter and social media, but nowhere near where we currently are. No, not many people were on tweeting about the butt fumble when the butt fumble happened. But was so popular and so incredible. I mean, I'm not lying. That was pretty funny. It was a funny moment.
Funny as hell.
Really funny, hilarious. And it has, survived all the way until now. You scroll on Twitter on any given Sunday during the football season, you'll probably see at least a GIF of the butt fumble. That's just how popular that is. Now, to Mark Sanchez's credit, he's taken it very well, and he's been a good sport, and he's laughed at it, and so it's not that big of a deal. But not everyone's built the same way to handle criticism the same way. It is interesting. It's an interesting conversation because you can see both sides, and you can also see how these modern athletes are probably asked to put up with a little bit more in terms of that criticism from the normal person, because you get it from the media members whenever you were an athlete, but you didn't necessarily get it in a medium in which you could actively see it every day from just any old fan.
Yeah, no, those are great points. I also think that, a player, for example, that jumps to mind on the 49ers that may have been, I don't know if affected by this, because he's talking about stress. And I don't think this player, at least to me, was affected by stress, but definitely perceived by the fans, would be Mike McGlinchey, who's currently no longer on the team. That guy gets associated with all of his downfalls, and particularly the play that Jimmy Garoppolo broke his ankle on because he missed a block. Whereas if you look at the totality of his season, you go through each play by play, you're going to see that he had a pretty damn good year, but he gets associated with the low light. And that, I think, is what George Kittle is also speaking to. Conversely, I also think that some athletes do get a little bit heightened by some social media play. And I mean, okay, you're talking about the butt fumble, a player to me that was benefited by social media far more than was ever necessary is Tim Tebow. Tim Tebow, each and every week, was hyped up for one throw or two throws or a one shining moment, and was a dog water quarterback for the better part of his NFL career. That guy was not a good quarterback. And yet each and every week he gets hyped up on these, Sports Center shows or NFL Live. I apologize for not knowing what shows they had back then, but that would be my example of a social media star that didn't necessarily need to be or should not have been looked at as one. And I apologize for degrading Tim Tebow, but he's the first guy that came to mind.
Do you remember a couple years ago, it was now, when Tim Tebow was trying to make it in baseball in the Mets organization
I
and
do.
just the
Yeah.
media circus? I mean, you have experience in minor league
I
baseball.
worked in the same league. Like, I saw him. Like, he should not have been there.
Like, it's ridiculous. What was he in? Like Double-A? Was that the highest he got?
He was a Double-A All-Star for the Binghamton Rumble Ponies.
What a
I'm
great
not
name.
going to say that it was because Binghamton was hosting the All-Star game that year in the Eastern League, and his 260 average compared to the rest of the outfielders was around 10th, and they needed to sell tickets. I'm not going to say that, Mark. I'm not going to say that.
Gotcha.
But Tim Tebow, yes, he was an All-Star in Double-A at age 40 or whatever he was.
Yeah, so I mean, that's just to further your point. I mean, he's just a social media darling, is what he is at that point. The fact that he could bring all this media attention to Double-A when in reality, no one outside of the fans in the area and the people working the games care about the results, wins or losses, all that much. It's just about individual players trying to work their way up into the big leagues. But that's not the case with Tim Tebow. A name that came to mind for me on the other extreme, you were talking about, careers perhaps inflated by social media, and this was kind of still on the dawn of social media. But if I say to you or to any other 49ers fan this name, what do you think of? Kyle Williams. What comes to mind?
2 drop punts.
Yeah. And that's how he's remembered for the rest of his life.
Yep.
And I mean, I remember it was early. I think it was probably more so Facebook than anything else when that happened. But I remember seeing a lot of people saying some pretty nasty things about him. I don't even want to repeat them. Like that.
Yeah.
And he goes on and he has to, I mean, another example, this isn't even sports related, but the Warriors situation with Andrew Wiggins right now and the rumors that his family is having to deal with. I mean, that's what these modern day athletes have to deal with today. And you might say, hey, turn off your phone, like whatever, don't look at it. But those are challenges that other athletes in the past haven't had to deal with, at least to this level.
Yeah, and I don't want to make this about people's lowlights, but Michael Crabtree, let's play a name association game.
Oh, God. That one's a little difficult for me. He had a good career with the 49ers, but I just remember him not being able to catch that touchdown pass in the Super Bowl.
And I remember Richard Sherman and Aaron Andrews like that. But like that's what kind of social media takes us to for a lot of these players. And it, works well. Like if I say Marshawn Lynch, you think Beastquake. That's a positive. If I say Jimmy Garoppolo, you think missing Emmanuel Sanders or stepping out of the back of the end zone or really whatever you choose.
The Jimmy Garoppolo one's a little more difficult. There's a number of them you could choose.
Yeah, and I know that's George Kittle's boy, so I apologize using him as a goat here in this situation. Scapegoat, not greatest, maybe more of a goat, but yeah. Mark, so basically, I think what George Kittle is discussing is where my childish and juvenile head heads towards. We need to be better because otherwise these athletes that we love and cover are going to feel more unnecessary stress as a result.
Yeah, no, you're right. And I mean, if George Kittle is telling you this, it's probably because he's felt that way in the past, and who knows what that stress does to him in a game. If he's carrying that with him, does it affect his performance? I don't know. So, I mean, maybe if you're a fan of the team and you're on social media yelling at George Kittle, again, it's your right. You can do whatever you want, but maybe George Kittle sees it and maybe he carries that with him into a game. I don't know. And maybe that affects him.
Yeah, I would certainly hope not. Although people have nice things to say about George Kittle. He seems like a decent dude.
Seems like a great dude.
That'll wrap up this episode of the 415ers podcast. Please let us know if you have any feedback for the show. Obviously, ratings, reviews are appreciated on wherever you download your podcast from. But if you want to DM either of us with suggestions, questions, topics, we'd be happy to hear them. We are covering the 49ers, of course, for the Odyssey Sports Podcast Network and 95.7 The Game. That is Mark Grandy. I'm Evan Giddings. We are coming at you twice a week. We'll be back on Tuesday with our next episode as we look ahead towards the draft. There's a lot going on for the 49ers. I know they don't have a top pick, but there's still a lot to discuss. So we look forward to doing that as we say goodbye on this episode of the 415ers podcast. We appreciate you tuning in. We'll talk to you next time.